Greetings. Welcome to Harrell Kagler Presents. I am Dr. J. Harrell Sims, and you are watching Blacknificent. Please like, subscribe, share, comment. We do this because of you, so make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, hit that bell for notifications when we upload a new video. Today's subject is something that us SoCal residents know a little bit about. And basically the only thing we know is there's water, and that is Manhattan Beach. Today to talk about our story of Manhattan Beach is our wonderful guest, Jasmine Gates. Jasmine is a journalist, educational coach. She's a world traveler, and she is the founder and creator of the New Black History Makers. You can go to newblackhistorymakers.com for more information. She also has had her work in the Real Urban News and featured in the Final Call newspaper. She has a great love and passion for our youth and for the truth. Let's welcome Jasmine Gates.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah.
So today we're talking about our towns, and we are in Southern California, and there's a little bit of history that I think most of us don't know, because what she's going to introduce us to, actually, I didn't know about till I was about 30 years old. So all that time, so it's never been taught. So again,
Right.
Here we are bringing you the history that you don't learn in school. So Jasmine, what are you presenting today?
So first of all, thank you for the platform. I'm definitely grateful. What I'm bringing is Bruce's Beach. The story, it happened here in Manhattan Beach, but this is definitely a great platform, and there's so many people who do not know about it. So I'm grateful to be able to share it. However, I cannot put all the credit on me. I have to shout out Dr. Robert Lee Johnson and Dr. Allison Jefferson Rose. About a year ago, I was at the Pan-African Film Festival, and there was a film playing Dystopia, or Displacement in Los Angeles, in Utopia. And Dr. Robert Lee Johnson was the narrator, and he had mentioned Bruce's Beach. I wrote it down in my journal because he said it was once Black owned, and we don't hear about that. You know, me being from LA, I've never heard Black owned and beach in the same, or resort in the same kind of context. So I wrote it down, didn't really know how it was going to manifest in my life. I thought I was just going to maybe go and take a picture or drive by or something and just be like, hey, I'm here. But it's really been a staple for me the past year. So it's ironic that a year later that we're here. I've been doing work at the park. I've been close with some of the residents that are there, some of the Black residents that are there that are operating with the local officials. So it's been interesting, but I'm definitely on the grounds there, and it's definitely took a whole different place of my life. And then Dr. Allison Jefferson Rose, she's been doing a lot of great work with beach cities and waterfronts, and just stories that include Black leisure as it relates to water places and everything. She's been doing a lot of the history and just breaking the ground essentially, and making sure that these cities are recognizing our history because it's not being recognized. So so shout out to them, because I would not know this history if it was not for them. So I'm definitely grateful for that. But for Bruce's Beach, like I said, it was based in, and let me share the PowerPoint. Why did it was just
So while she's looking to prepare to share, I just want to let everyone know. So if you've ever, me growing up by the beach, pretty much, it's interesting that Manhattan Beach was one of the beaches we never really felt welcomed there. You went, but you didn't really feel welcome. So they didn't bother you, but in the air, you just didn't feel welcome. So
right.
Tell us about Bruce's Beach, Manhattan Beach to us.
Yeah, so it's Bruce's Beach, essentially, there's a family, the Bruces, and this was basically brought into fruition, and they bought the resort and all of that, bought the land, built a resort back in the early 1900s, so 1912. But for Manhattan Beach, which was established in 1912, the Bruces actually bought the land prior to Manhattan Beach actually being chartered. So Manhattan Beach didn't become Manhattan Beach until late in 1912. They had bought the land in June of 1912. So they had came in, just a little history about Manhattan Beach. It was initially occupied by the Tonga village, and then it was the Spanish were there, the Mexican were there. And then also, if you look at the area, it encompassed Inglewood, Gardena, it encompassed also Redondo Beach, Manhattan Beach, and El Segundo. So that was what Redondo Beach was a part of. And then at some point, Daniel Freeman, he was the last person to actually own it in 1885 before the early 1900s. And then we'll talk more about George Peck because he had a big effect on the negative resistance that came to the Bruces. So he and Stuart Merrill and Frank S. Daughtry, they all went and basically co-founded this new city called Manhattan Beach, which started with 600 citizens. It was half residential and then half resort. As we know, it's a beautiful city. So that's essentially how they got started. As far as what was going on, I think with my generation, we don't often talk about the Great Migration. When you talk about the Black and African-American people moving from the South, them going either to the East, Northeast, or a lot of them also came to California. A lot of us, we talk about, my grandmother is from Mississippi, or my grandmother is from Alabama, or this, but we don't know the weight that holds when we're saying that. The weight that is that our grandparents essentially wanted better for themselves and the generations to come. So they moved out of the South, which was heavy with Jim Crow, which was heavy with just limiting them from just doing the normal things of life. So they moved to these places, and that's essentially what the Bruces did. The records, I'm not sure where they were initially, but the records show that they came from New Mexico around between 1900 to 1910. They had moved from New Mexico and went to LA, and they were entrepreneurs in their own right. Essentially, they owned Mr. Bruce. He was a chef, and he also owned a railroad company. Mrs. Bruce, there's nothing really detailed about what she did. I think there was some piece of art that she kind of dived into. There was also just her hospitality that kind of kept the resort going. That's what you can see as the history goes on. But what is basically detailed and what we have in history is what Mr. Bruce, what he did with his time. So they came to LA. They still had their house in New Mexico. They owned that house. They were free and clear with that. And they also owned a home in Los Angeles, and we're free and clear with that. So I think that's important to note, because a lot of times when you think about what was going on in the 1900s, we often think that Black people just were like not doing anything, that we didn't have anything of substantial, history to highlight, but they were really operating in this, what we love to call entrepreneurship. They were doing that, and they had enough money to go to this new town, Manhattan Beach, and to purchase land there. And that's essentially what they did. So February 1912, like I said, Mrs. Bruce, she is on the deed for that. She purchased the very first lot. It is in between 26th and 27th, and it's west of Highland, if anyone is familiar with the land there. So if you've ever been to Bruce's Beach as of right now is a grass plain. Essentially, it's like kind of hilly and it overlooks the water. That's not where the lot was. They were a little closer into the water. So it's kind of like right under the S. If you're looking at the screen, kind of like if you look at the Essen Resort and you just drop down, that's essentially where their place was, with the land that they bought, and that's where they had built the resort. So that was the land. They opened up the Bruce's Resort in June of 1912, and then the lodge opened 1913. So she also purchased a second lot in August of 1920. So you can see that they were acquiring money. And it's interesting to me because they weren't forced to move until probably closer to the late 1920s, but they were there for some time. So there's not a lot of history in terms of what was going on during that time. I'm sure the white people were definitely pushing back. The KKK was very active during this time. I'm sure that they were doing things, but it's just very interesting to me that they were able to, even 8 years later, Mrs. Bruce was able to buy new property there. But the city didn't seem to really get moving and really attempt to push them out until the late 1920s. So that was just interesting to me because I'm like, well, what happened, during that time, or what was kind of the deciding factor after almost 15 years of them, or 10 to 15 years of them being in that land and really acquiring wealth. So the representation and the impact of what they did for Black people around that time, there were a lot of Black people that were coming for the day, just coming to get some sun, to coming to the waterfront, wanting to, take a dip in the water and all of that. There were also people that were staying overnight. So with that, just as people in general, we see something that seems to be safe for us. And I can imagine back in that time with everything that was happening and the negative effect that it had on Black people, a safe space really meant something to Black people. So when Black people back in that time saw, oh, okay, we're here and they're thriving, it's like, okay, well, let's all congregate there. Let's build community. And they really just built like an anchor in that place and let Black people know, like, this is a very safe place for us to come. So Black people wanted to move there. So by 1919, there were 6 African-American families that had moved there, and their names are on the screen. So you have Mr. and Mrs. Prelu, you have Miss Patterson, Miss Sanders, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, John McCaskill, and Alyssa Irvin, and then the Slaughter family. So they pretty much were rocking with the Bruces. They, as you'll see later on in the story, when things started getting rocky, they were all kind of filing together. They kind of all stayed as a community. So they bought lots. John McCaskill and Elisa Irvin and the Slaughter family, those two did not buy lots on the Bruce's actual land. What they did, they had it kind of near there, but it wasn't actually on the land. So the others, they were actually on the plots that they had bought essentially, and some of them had half of it, some of them had the whole thing, but they were, just thriving, and more people were eventually coming in. So it really was creating this image of generational wealth, them creating and acquiring the wealth that they did from the resort. It was a year-round attraction. People were coming in all year. It wasn't just a summer thing for them, and they were coming to get this safe place that the Bruces were offering. And the city, of course, did not receive them well. As I said before, there was a lot of time in between when they got there and when they were forced to leave, essentially. However, they were there since the first day. They were resisting since the very first day. The Los Angeles Times, they also put out an article basically saying that there was the waters were troubled, essentially. Like, Black people were here, and the citizens essentially felt that their property value would have gone down. And considering the times, it was very likely for their property value to go down because of the amount of Black people that were coming to visit that place, which is very interesting when you think about it. Of course, now today we have just the liberty to kind of be where we want this. Of course, there's a lot of I'll say social restrictions, and where we want to be and where we can go. But in terms of the masses kind of coming to try and push us out, that doesn't happen as often. It still happens, but not as often as it is happening here. So like I said earlier, the KKK, they had chapters in Redondo and Hermosa, which are very close if you're familiar with LA, or Los Angeles County, I should say. And the citizens just continued to express their dissatisfaction. The people that were going to Bruce's Beach, Definitely, they were Black people. They would come back to their cars with slashed tires. There were fires that were being caused all around the area. There were fake parking signs that they were putting up saying you can only park here for 10 minutes. And then there were deputies that were patrolling the area. So it made it seem, we know if we're parking illegally, or we see a sign and we see deputies driving around, we probably are not going to park there, and it's going to deter us. So it was a deterrent for the people that were going there, them seeing these signs. And it was mostly, as I was reading, it was mostly targeted towards the people that were not familiar with it. So a local would have been like, okay, they're tripping, but someone that is just on vacation, you're kind of, trying to be on your toes about everything and be mindful of things. So it really was a deterrent to people. People were not trying to really essentially get ticketed or even come into contact negatively with the police officers. So especially during that time, when you think of what was going on back then. Now, okay, we might get a ticket, it might turn into something that's really negative, but back then it was like, let's just not really even test the waters. So that was a deterrent for them, the parking signs. They also destroyed property. There were mattresses that were from the Bruce's Lodge and the Bruce's Resort. They essentially would burn them. They would just burn a whole bunch of things. And of course, it left the Bruce's with having to fix the things that were going on. It's also interesting to me, what I want to point out is, even through all of this, the Bruce's still were able to maintain their their clientele. Essentially, they were still able to retain their finances. Even with the destruction that was happening, they were able to rebuild and to keep moving for quite some time. So it really speaks to this term we've kind of overused of Black excellence back in that day, where they were really thriving. Mrs. Bruce, she said in an LA Times article, like, they're not moving me from my land, I'm staying here. And that she stayed there as long as she can. I really wish that there was more of an account of maybe even the year by year of what she felt or what she was going through. And just to see, like, what, how was it? How did you withstand that time? A lot of times I was watching Dr. Sims, another video of yours, and I think you were saying one of your students had said, their generation didn't fight, essentially, and we're fighting. And it's interesting because my brand is, I'm a new Black history maker, and there's people that have read it and said, well, yeah, we're not our ancestors. And I'm like, well, no, that's not what I'm trying to say with that. It's that they made history, and now it's our turn to make history. They did the work. And I think if we would have an account of that, of how she withstood through those years, how her and Mr. Bruce withstood through those years with their business, it would definitely help us, and we would have a better gauge on how we should even run business like now today. So I, am grateful for the accounts that we do have, but I would love to have sit down with Mrs. Bruce and Mr. Bruce to see, like, how did you withstand the racist attacks and all of that. So like I said, they destroyed property. They also tried to find ways to incriminate the Bruces. So during that time, the prohibition laws were also in effect. So that having to do with alcohol, they were attempting to plant alcohol at the resort or at the lodge. And that was something where I'm assuming they needed some type of license, and they were not providing that. So it's also interesting because now it's like, we don't have a good time without any type of drink, but they did not have any, and they were still having such a great time. So that also stood out to me. But they were trying to incriminate them. That did not fall through, but that was something that there are records of, that they were definitely trying to make happen. And they did not, out of all the things, they were not able to become successful in that. So also with the resist, to people that are very important, not important, they were key factors in the resistance. So they're the two Georges, as I like to call them, George H. Peck and George Lindsey. So George H. Peck, he was the city founder, as I said earlier, and he also was a realtor. George Lindsey was also a realtor. So George H. Peck, from the first day, he had the land between, so if I can go back, so his land, if you look where it says resort at the R, well, let's go to Bruce's, the S under Bruce's. So directly down, there's a place. It kind of looks as if it's together, but they're different buildings. So his land is right there and the Bruce's are there. So it's kind of hard to tell, but as the story goes, they had to pass through George Peck's land to get to the water. So what he did was put up barriers and put up no trespassing signs so that they had to go around. They had to go a little over half a mile to get to the water. And it's like, okay, we're on vacation. That's what you're going. You're going to LA. You're going to see you want to see the water, especially when you're going to a resort, a beachfront. You want to see the water. So you would think that deterred them. But from the accounts, it did not. They walked that half a mile and got there, but that was something George Peck was trying to do to make sure, or to try and stop the progression of the Bruces. So it didn't work. Like we said, I'm sure there's some people who are like, I'm not walking it, I'm just stay, back or whatever. But he definitely did make an attempt to do that. And with him being the city founder, there's also a lot of misinformation, especially on the plaque that sits on the land now. It says something to the effect of him being an ally or him setting aside land for the Bruces, which is definitely, it makes me look at the city, and I'll get back into that a little later, but it's like, did you guys do the research? And I'm sure you did the research, I'm sure you know the story, but you also tried to make it seem as if one of the main culprits was a friend or was someone that helped them, as if Black people could not acquire land or buy things on their own. So they put him as this kind man that set aside land for African Americans, and that was not the truth at all. There's actually no record of that. There's actually more records that show that he was actually against them, which is more consistent with American history regardless. So he essentially, that's just the story of that. So don't let it be confused or anything. But that's his story.
That exactly. It's his story. That's
Right.
called the whitewashing of our story.
Right.
Continue.
And that's essentially what that is. And this is not, that plaque was not written in the 1900s. That plaque was written in 2006. So like I said, I'll get into what's happening on the grounds now a little later after the history. But now when it comes to George Lindsey was simply a realtor and a citizen. And he essentially just felt like he just needed to be the culprit of white supremacy and make sure that these people were not here. I'm going to get into the city ordinances first, just to go over them, because since it was a new city, they also had, and there's a lot of things that we think when we hear this story where we're like, well, how was this able to happen? How was this able to happen? You have to take into account that this was a new city, and then also this was like, white people were just kind of like doing whatever. There was no governance of kind of the racism. They could be racist via the law. They can also do it now, but it's a little more on the back end now. We're going to create policy that is racist rather than really put the racism in their face. So like the no trespassing signs, that was specifically for Black people. That's not something that we'll see today, as I'm, saying. Now, today it might be, don't come in here with a t-shirt and don't come in here with that and this and that. So it's like, it's not specifically for Black people, but we know that this is something that Black people may acquire. And not that the t-shirt thing is, specific to us, but I'm just trying to give context as to what they'll use in terms of policy. So I'll go back to George Lindsey, but the new city ordinances. So this was prior to the 1920s, I want to say. So these city ordinances could not shut down the Bruces. As you can see, I'll read the language. One must apply to the Board of Trustees in order to keep bathhouses, social clubs, theaters, dance halls, billiard, pool rooms, public shooting galleries, bowling alleys, or any places of public amusement. With the Bruce's Lodge and Bruce's Resort, they did have the theater room, they did have a dance hall. It was public amusement, essentially, so that was like directly to them. And then also, number two, it was illegal for any bathhouse to be built east of the Pacific Electric Railroad track. So that did not, like I said, prevent the Bruces from being able to be in business. What it did was prevent them from being able to expand. So as I said earlier, from 1912 to 20, Mrs. Bruce bought her second lot. So they were acquiring money and they were able to expand. Once they put this ordinance out, they were not able to go east of it. And then also they weren't able to create anything of the sort of what was bringing them money. So it didn't put a stop to what they were doing, but it did limit their progression. And that was what the problem was for them. So now I'll go back to George Lindsey. So the Board of Trustees, what we now know is the City Council. So with George Lindsey, he just, like I said, he wanted to be the spearhead of white supremacy. He just wanted to make sure that the Bruces were not able to exist happily or peacefully on that land. So he went to the City Council or the Board of Trustees, if you will. He went to the Board of Trustees and he basically was telling them, like, we should condemn this land. This land should be used for something else. And you have to take into context, this was a new city. So it's like, why this land? Why here? So he began to continue to go in and basically say, this land, they need to be condemned. The Board of Trustees did not listen to him initially. And I don't know, I can't say that they did not listen to him, but there were no actions that came directly after that claim that he made or the request that he was making. So he continued to go to them, and then he went and created a petition. And to me, that takes a lot of effort now, because social media, we could just send the link. But now, back in that time, he had to walk to these houses and get these signatures. And it just speaks to the level of hate that existed in some of these people, that you would get up every day and go and walk to these houses like you're a politician, but you're not trying to garner anything but for them to sign a petition to get these Black successful people to be removed off this land because it makes you uncomfortable. So that really just speaks to me to the hate that existed essentially in these white people that lived in Manhattan Beach. I think, well, aside from the history, last night they actually did a presentation of Bruce's Beach, the city of Manhattan Beach. They did a presentation for Black History Month. And even in that, they were like, well, we don't want you guys to think that this is our history, that this made us who we are. And they go, well, the NAACP, they had one of their first demonstrations here. And to me, it was like, well, you don't understand. The only reason why we need to have demonstrations is because you're acting up, because you're not treating us the way that we need to be treated. But even sometimes to white people, it's like, we're going to do what we're going to do, but we're not going to expect, when you rebel against us or when you go and try to correct certain things, we're going to support you and we're going to celebrate you and say, okay, good job, but we're not going to change our actions.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's essentially what I feel like is happening. Even if you look at history, even with Dr. King, oh, we're happy that you wanted to do all these things, but we're not going to come behind you and make these changes that you're asking for, but I appreciate you for standing up for yourself. And that's essentially what they were doing. That's essentially what, to me, 2021, what today, we're February, that's what they said last night, this February 26th, was that we appreciate, the NAACP for coming out here and having the demonstration. They had a swim in, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but we're not going to change the behavior. And like I said, that was yesterday. So I think the city still has a little more work to do, but we're getting that together as well. But yes,
the country has a lot of work to do, because right now what we're seeing is nothing but symbolism.
Right.
Oh, we're going to put these people in place. Oh, we're going to put Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill when we're getting ready to be cashless. So all it is symbolism with no teeth, no tangibles. And that's what a lot of people are waking up to see. So seeing that then and now, this has been going on.
Yeah.
This is not new.
It's really
continue.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, it's really not new. And like you said, it's the country. We're seeing this all over the place. And it's very interesting because this is a story that would have definitely just gone and been forgotten about. And I'll get into why it has been able to kind of withhold. Like I said, there's a lot of holes in the story, but there's still, as you can see, a lot of information there that leads to what we all know to be true, that America just has a very distinct DNA to its culture. And they continue to just show themselves even now today. So essentially, the way that the city went about doing it, as I was saying earlier, this was now the policy that they were putting in place, was eminent domain, which was them basically saying, we need to take the land that you're on, that you own, and we want to make it a public place. We need to use it for the public of the citizens that are here. So when it came down, the ordinance to take the land. So let me also go back. The petition that George Lindsey had put out, he went back and brought that to the city. Once he brought that to the city, there's no record of them actually going and saying, hey, yes, we are going to listen to George Lindsey and we're going to make this happen. However, they ended up doing what he asked for after the petition had went out. So January 3rd, 1924, ordinance number 1, which was to take the land, it went into that was when they introduced it. It went into effect February 7th of 1924. And then ordinance number 2 to condemn the properties, that went into effect July of 1924. So they were condemning 30 lots. Of those 30 lots, 5 of them were Black owned, the other 25 were white owned, but none of them had been built upon. None of them were being used the same way that the Bruces were. So that was a direct attack, in my opinion, and you guys can read it as you wish, but that was a direct attack on Black businesses and the progression of Black people, the progression of the finances of Black people. So like they said, when they went, interestingly enough, the white people that were there barely even protested it. The Black people that were there were the ones to do most of the protesting because, like I said, there was finances coming through that land. If you think of now today, let's think of what it would look like for you to go to Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach, Venice, and have a Black-owned resort on that land. I don't even think they would allow it today. Or even if they did acquire the land, I think there would be so much pushback even today. So imagine back then what that looked like, having that resort on the waterfront, not something that's in the middle of the city, but literally on the water. And that's where we know some of the most expensive things are, right there in front of the water. So also, if anyone is familiar, we should be with city councils and how they work. There is the Ralph M. Brown Act, which went into effect after these situations were happening. But the Ralph M. Brown Act was basically what made it so that the city council and local officials have to debrief and make decisions in front of the public. So since it was before, the city council was able to make this decision for the Bruces and for that land privately. So there was no retaliation. There was no explanation of what's going on or how are you guys going about this? Why are you doing that? Now we know, you can go and ask questions and stuff, and you can go and present your case essentially to the city council, but they were not able to. So if there were any questions about, well, why didn't people protest prior to, or how were they able to just do that? The Ralph M. Brown Act was, which came after, which would have made it so that they would have to go and present their case to the public, to the citizens. So also with that, with them condemning the land, and this really is interesting to me, they leased the land to Mr. Bassinet. They leased it to him for $1 a year. And that really spoke to me because it, like I was saying, with the George Lindsey thing, him deciding to wake up every day and go get these signatures for the petition, them leasing the land to Mr. Bassinet was basically like them saying, hold this real quick. We don't want to actually do anything with the land, and you'll see why I'm saying that a little later, but we don't want to do anything with the land, but we're going to give it to you for $1 a year for 12 months. He had this lease. And that was just very interesting to me because nothing was being done with the land once they were actually forced to move off the land. And let me see. No. Yeah, so nothing was essentially done with the land. So once, and let me, okay, that I was like, where did the other slide go? I'm sorry. So then there was the rebellion. So like I just mentioned, the ordinances were put out, and Mr. and Mrs. Bruce, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Major and Mrs. Prelo, and Miss Patterson, they all filed against the ordinances. And what they were asking for essentially was for more money. So they all essentially asked for more money. However, I will detail the Bruces. All of them maybe got a couple hundred more than what they asked for. They initially asked for thousands more. So the Bruces, who owned the 2 lots and had the resorts there, they were to be given $14,500. They were like, no. They asked for $70,000 for the land. They asked for, I believe it was $50,000 for the damages, and it was $90,000 altogether for the damages, and along with the $70,000. And rightfully so, with everything that had been happening, especially with the KKK coming in and the different white citizens just disrupting what they had going on and literally destroying a lot of their property. Rightfully so. They deserve that money if they were going to move. So the city said no and didn't even give them $1 more. They stuck with the $14,500. And some of the people, I believe Miss Patterson and the Johnsons, no, it's the Slaughters that I mentioned earlier. They stayed in Manhattan Beach and bought places elsewhere. And one of them even had built up a hotel. They were not able to buy on the waterfront. So when you think of real estate, I'm not in real estate, but like I said earlier, the closer you get to the water, the more expensive it is, the more luxurious it is, right? The closer, when you can see the water, when you have a view, that is, the best essentially, especially when you're living here in LA. So they were not able to buy anywhere on the waterfront as Black people. They had to go more inland. So they had to be where there wasn't a view, where people didn't want to go. They wanted to keep Black people away from this luxurious, area, essentially, where we love to vacation and we love to spend our time. So there's no detailed account of why the Bruces did not stay. They didn't say that, but it's very clear. Why would I want to stay where I'm not wanted, where you guys did all of this to basically just shut my business down? Because that's essentially what happened. It wasn't that they were just living there. And I think sometimes the story gets told that way, that these people just had a house here and it was that. But no, they had business there and they stopped their dollar or their bag, as we like to say now. And that's not something, why would you, continue to stay there? So they all filed the ordinances. Like I said, a few of them got a few hundred more dollars, but the Bruces literally, they got stuck at the $14,500 and they decided to move out of the city. And from the accounts, I do believe that they did go and own a restaurant, but there isn't really more details of what they did after that. They kind of just took their money and left. And, you can imagine why. So when it comes to the rebellion, the city, in the spirit of white supremacy, they were still trying to keep Black people from enjoying the land. So simply swimming, they didn't even want that in the water. They did not even want that. So what happened on Memorial Day 1927, we go to the beach. They went to the beach and they were not asking for anything, excuse me. They went to the beach and they were swimming. There was Black people there swimming along with other people that were swimming. The police wrote down, it said that they wrote down, so I'm guessing they were trying to ticket them, 25 Black people's names. No, they gave them their names, and from that, they did not leave, but they just had, gave them their names. The community, the Black community, knowing that that was going to be a problem. So there was another incident, July 4th. There was a 19-year-old, a Black female student from UCLA. I believe it was UCLA. She was arrested. When she was arrested, that's essentially when the NAACP stepped in. They went in and they essentially were fighting this case because there were no trespassing signs on the beach. And the no trespassing signs came from Mr. Bassinet, who I mentioned earlier, who had leased the land for $1 a year. So when they went in, I also have to make mention of the Black-owned newspaper, the California Eagle. They were definitely a source for me in coming up with some of the information. Well, because they had a few articles. So they were also, in terms of informing the people what was going on, they were also letting them know what to do. So they were saying, there are civil rights laws that will protect you. There's this that will protect you. And that's kind of how the NAACP, they stepped in. So they went in and basically were like, there's civil rights laws that will prevent you from being able to discriminate against anyone in public places. So from that story there, or from that case, essentially, they, Mr. Bassinet basically, like, he confessed that the signs were there for Black people, and the city was like, okay, take the signs down. We're taking the land back from you. Black people, you guys can go and now swim in the land. So that was like a major win for the NAACP. That was 1927. They won the case of them trying to prevent Black people from swimming in a public ocean front. They went in 1928 and they had their they had their convention essentially in Los Angeles. So it was kind of riding on the bank of that. So that's what the city was talking about yesterday when they were like, well, the NAACP had their first demonstration here. Well, yeah, they had their first demonstration here because your grandfathers and your great-grandfathers were acting up and they were not allowing the Bruces or Black people in general to just enjoy the ocean front, which should be privy to everyone. So yes, they did have one of their first demonstrations here, and it was a swim-in. They said about 10 to 15 members of the NAACP came to, but I'm not sure how many people were actually there that actually came to partake in the actual swim-in. But it seemed to be pretty effective considering the outcome of what actually happened. So that kind of wrapped up what had happened there in terms of the Bruces. There wasn't much detailed after. Now, what I will get into in a little bit is the aftermath of what the city started doing. So also what's to be noted is that the city did not put a park up until maybe about 1956. So that's about 30 years that the land was just sitting there. The land was just sitting there and nothing was being done with it. So it was like, you rather have this land sit here and become nothing rather than allow Black people to make money off of what's here, or just Black people to exist on this land. And that's essentially what happened. There's accounts, I'm forgetting the guy's name. He is one of the main reasons, Robert Brigham's, I'm so sorry. Robert Brigham he was a citizen there. And one of the main reasons the story is available to us today was because he would walk around and he saw this vacant lot, and it was just kind of like, literally, like, everybody would ask, well, what happened there? Why is this park here? It wasn't even a park, it was just a lot. It was a vacant lot with nothing being done to it. So you can imagine for 30 years, it was kind of this like dark story that haunted the town, because it was like, oh, so y'all were on, that kind of energy. You guys were preventing Black people from, and then other people were there was just a lot of different stories. So definitely grateful for him, because now, if we go, let's say without his account, he did a thesis, without his account, if we go to the park and read the plaque doesn't tell the story completely. So him going in the 1950s and still being able to talk to people who were actually around, and they weren't like, you know, the grandchildren of people that were around, but people that were actually around when that happened, gave us, even though there are a lot of holes in the story, it gave us a lot of clarity in terms of what really happened. So him doing that work and him doing that thesis, I can only imagine him walking around and literally seeing that, and just and then for him to find all this information and say, wow, this is what this lot has been, and you guys literally have done nothing with it for 30 years. So the city essentially made it a park because they needed to cover themselves. They were basically like, well, yeah, now people are learning about this place that we have that we haven't done anything with. So to cover ourselves, now let's hurry up and make it a park. So do what we said we were going to do with it back in the 1920s, essentially. So that's what came of it. They made it a park. The Bruce's family, there's their great grandchild, I believe, and maybe their grandchild, he's, you know, been kind of active, but they've said, you know, it has not, it's a negative thing for their family, as you can imagine. If you think of, we talk about generational wealth all the time, and the Bruces were definitely setting themselves up for that, and for the city to essentially come in and take that. And then you go back and look at the land, and it's just a park. It's just grass. And there's also, well, the park is there, but then where the land is there, it's nothing there. And it's like, wow, you did this. And look at how the city has progressed. Look at how many people are making money here. And you took that from our family. So I can imagine just how it sits with their family. And they've made mention of it, that it is something that's tormenting from.
So
Go ahead. Sorry.
So fast forwarding for the sake of time.
Yeah.
What, you know, it's interesting that they would have this thing and you to talk about the history. And of course, they're going to whitewash the history because Black history is always whitewashed. And this is the reason why Harrell Kagler interventions, this is why we're doing Blacknificent, is just to get, we don't want to give them the whole story. We just want to give them enough.
Right.
So they will go and research it for themselves, because most of us, it's embarrassing, but I would say a majority of us do not know our story.
Yeah.
So Manhattan Beach is a beach that I grew up around, but it wasn't a one that we were comfortable. We just, Redondo Beach, Venice Beach, Dockweiler, Santa Monica, but Manhattan for some reason always had this energy that
Right.
it's nice being here, but it's like for some reason you just didn't feel it.
Right.
So let's get into the aftermath.
Okay, yeah. So, like I said, 1956, the park was finally established, and the name changed a few times. It went from Bayview Terrace, if any of you are familiar with the work that is being done in Santa Monica. That name pretty much comes from there. And then 1974, Park Culiacan, they were a sister city of Manhattan Beach, and from what I read, they essentially are not a sister city anymore. I'm not sure how that works, but they were a sister city, so they named the park after them. So that's what you can see in the top right. And then 2006 was Bruce's Beach, when the city was like, no, we need to make atonement, I guess atonement, for what went wrong or the history of this beach, because no one really knew, like, why is this beach here? So then they named it Bruce's Beach. And then in 2020, they created a task force for Bruce's Beach, a Bruce's Beach task force, which is in existence now. So that the task force was who put on the kind of like Zoom description of the story, the history last night, which is what I was referring to. So there's been a lot. Like I said, I had got introduced to it through Dr. Robert Lee Johnson, and that is essentially, I went down there for, so if you can see in the bottom left and the bottom two pictures, Breonna Taylor's, this was after George Floyd was murdered. Breonna Taylor's birthday was about a week later. So about June 5th or June 6th, I went down there and invited some Black women. It turned into about 200 people that came out there. So we went down there, and I was thinking, of course, because of COVID, I was like, well, where can we do this? And I remember Dr. Robert Lee Johnson mentioning Bruce's Beach. So I was like, well, let's just go down there since it was once Black owned and kind of do the thing. So a lot of people came. We've had a few other events. There's some other people that have been doing work down there, but we go there frequently and make sure that there's a Black presence in that space. And there's people that have pushed back with me and been like, well, I don't want to go because Manhattan Beach isn't really welcoming to Black people. But if we bring in 200 people down there, I would love for them to come and bother us while we're down there. But it's been, for me, Bruce's Beach has been it's just been amazing to see how it's kind of taken place in my life and in the place of people around. Most of the time when people hear about it or I mention it or I say we're going here, they don't know about it. So whenever we have an event, I'm sure to share the history a few times. But it's, we're trying to definitely do the work. The task force is not, they're being very consistent with their grandparents. I'll say that. So they aren't being the most, I won't say open, but they just are not operating in the way that they should be operating when you're trying to make atonement or make something right for the family that was harmed, the Black family that was harmed. So that's pretty much it in regards to the beach. I mean, if you want me to talk a little bit about what's going on now with the task force, I can. If not, then that's okay too. But that's pretty much it. And then just a thank you. So to, like I said, Dr. Robert Lee Johnson from the documentary, and then Dr. Allison Rose Jefferson, who has the book Living the California Dream. That's a book where she has a chapter and she talks about this, but she talks about the leisure sites in California, and it's she's very insightful. So with those two, I've had actual conversations with regarding this place, and that's why it's kind of grown and turned into this project for me in a way. And then Robert Brigham's, like I mentioned earlier, his thesis in the 1950s was basically the catalyst for the generation that was here with the Bruces and to us. Without his account of it or without his interest in the story, I don't know that we would know. I think we would have lost that story with the people that, passed away during that time.
Okay. This was a very, very good presentation, Jasmine. I really, it's eye-opening. And, for those who are watching the presentation, you just never know because our history is so hidden. We have Pico Boulevard. People don't realize that Pico Boulevard is named after Pio Pico, who was a Black Mexican. They don't understand or even have the knowledge that even the state, California, is named after a Black queen, Queen Khalifa. Right. Some say it's a legend. She's not really real. Well, where did it come from? Where did that come from? So I'm not. I don't have another hour to argue or talk about that. And then there are so many of these stories all over the country that are hidden and buried in our story, because of, the person who writes the books is the one who won the war, and of course it's always been his story. Many of us don't know about Central Avenue. I mean, growing up in Inglewood, right. Dare Heights, we're all up in there. The avenues. We didn't realize that Central Avenue was once the Harlem of LA. All of Central Avenue, that's where all the jazz clubs and entertainment was. And we couldn't fathom that that's, looking back then, we didn't know. We weren't taught that. Right. We weren't taught about Allensworth, which is in Tulare County, up towards Corcoran. Allensworth started 1908 founded by Colonel Allen Allensworth, who actually he died in Compton. I forgot what he died from, but he was enslaved in Louisville, Kentucky, in 1842, and he was the highest ranking Black officer in 1906 created a town right by the railroad tracks, very affluent, and it's still there. And they have a jubilee this time of the year every year. Don't know if they're doing that this year because of COVID. And then you even on all the way on the other side of the country, you have Eatonville. I went to Eatonville when I graduated. It is about 6 miles north of Orlando, Florida, and one of the first self-governing Black towns in the United States from actually 1887 is when Eatonville was actually founded, and Zora Neale Hurston, who was one of the great writers of the Harlem Renaissance, is from Eatonville. And when I was there, it was around January. It was in January, and they were having this festival. It's still there. It's a small town. They have their own police. They have their own everything. And you don't know these things because we're not taught our story. And I thank you being young and having this information, because my goal is, I can't tell you how many of my students have no knowledge of their history at all, except the same people, Frederick Douglass,
Right.
Harriet Tubman, Dr. King, Rosa Parks. It's like 10 to 15, Booker T. Washington,
Right.
10 to 15 people over and over and over,
Right.
and don't even know the history in their own backyard.
Right. Yeah. So that's definitely for me. It's just, with the brand, it's New Black History Makers. Well, how can I be new if I don't know where I come from? And that's what we coined it as. We're just celebrating those that are operating on the paths that our ancestors paved for us. But in order to operate on those paths, we have to know where they are. We have to know the history. So, like I said, I told you offline, this is definitely was up my alley. I was excited. I learned more about Bruce's Beach, even though, I know about it. People will ask me about it, but I'm like, I learned so much during the research. So I was glad to have a platform to share it, to tell more people about it. Because I think a lot of times, like I said, in the early 1900s, you think of what Black people were doing. I think somebody was like, well, was that a young person? Was like, well, was that slavery or something? And I'm like, no, they were actually entrepreneurs. They were actually owning things. Black people have not always just been in a rut. They had, Black people come from things and we have created things. So that's why this story just means so much to me. Me being an entrepreneur myself, like I said, I would love to have more accounts of what they went through and all of that. But I'm just grateful for the platform, grateful to be able to just push this story and continue the work of the people that I mentioned, Dr. Robert Lee Johnson, Dr. Allison Jefferson, and then Robert Brigham's to be continuing that legacy, essentially. I'm honored.
Well, I appreciate them teaching you, and I appreciate you teaching everyone that will watch this program. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. Hit the bell so you know every time we pull up, you'll know. Because we're going to bring you something that's going to edify your spirit. We are the first, we are the last, we are royalty, we are Blacknificent. So at this time, again, I want to thank my wonderful, wonderful guest who is, you just made me proud, Jasmine Gates. You made me proud. You gave me more than I was expecting. I am so proud and so happy. And so we'll end with this. Forever forward, never backwards. Peace. Hotep. Shalom.